for the carnivore and keto people listening to this is going to be hard to hear, but bear with me for a second. We are not designed to eat. Look at the difference. Number one, all you'd see is people dying left and right. Our bodies really haven't essentially changed biologically in 300,000 years. So, I mean, these are evolutionary designed reactions to the three most important things we need to do and do properly if we're going to continue as a species.
You're telling me this is because of a sharp rock?
100%. I'm now 49 years old. I'm healthier than I've ever been in my entire life. I am an archaeologist and anthropologist by training. I've been a college professor for almost 20 years, teaching anthropology and archaeology. And my specialty in that space is in what we call experimental archaeology. So I've been trained to replicate and experiment with a whole bunch of different primitive technologies like stone tool production, primitive ceramics, fibers, hide tanning, that sort of thing. And we use that approach to sort of interpret the archaeological record and try to understand what people were doing thousands of years ago or hundreds of thousands of years ago. And at the same time, I've always been interested in food, nutrition, and health. I was a Division I wrestler at Ohio State. I've always had battled my own weight, my own health through food. And it wasn't until I put both my interest in food, nutrition, and health and my archaeological and anthropological training together that I really started to, for number one, ask the right questions, and number two, start to answer some of those questions. I'm now 49 years old. I'm healthier than I've ever been in my entire life, and that includes my time as a Division I athlete. I raised my family this way. I've spent the past, well, really almost decade and a half of my time traveling and working, as my entire family traveling and working with indigenous and traditional groups around the world, learning how they're still implementing ancestral foodways into their diet to make their food as healthy and nourishing as possible. About 6 years ago, I co-starred on a National Geographic series, The Great Human Race, which was really a huge culminating activity for my work, where my co-star and I were placed in 10 different places around the world in situations beginning at about 2.5 million years ago in Tanzania, where I had to replicate the technologies from that time period, and we had to live using only tools from that specific time period. We went all through Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and over to North America. We were really the only two people ever to have lived that have experienced at some level all of the major time periods of our ancestral dietary past. And as a result of that, I mean, we didn't live our entire lives on each one of these, but long enough to really understand the benefits of those types of approaches. More recently, I've been trained as a chef, and my wife and I have a nonprofit called the Eastern Shore Food Lab, which is where our teaching and research and outreach come from, and the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, which is a foodery where we're actually producing the food that we fully believe in using ancestral approaches. And most recently, I have a book that just released called Eat Like a Human, and it came out in November.
You're like the modern day Indiana Jones. So something when I first started eating more ancestral, I didn't understand initially, why does it matter what people ate millions of years ago? Because millions of years ago, they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have cars, they didn't, we have a very different life. So what does it matter that we look back and see what other people are eating? So I'm sure you are the man to explain why we should be looking at the past and trying to replicate what we were eating.
That is such a great question because, and there's several ways to answer. Number one, I'll say, yes, we are living in a modern time that is completely different in just about every way than anything from our past. It's different now than it was 5 years ago, and certainly different now than it was 500,000 years ago. However, we're still inhabiting caveman and cavewomen bodies. Our body, the modern day Homo sapiens, literally us, the same body, the same brain size, the same digestive tract, the same way of processing food when food gets into our bodies, same tooth size, all of it, we appeared about 300,000 years ago. So our bodies really haven't essentially changed biologically in 300,000 years. So certainly you can make a case to say, yeah, so many of us are not as active as we were in the past, and so many of us are, doing different things. And it's true, those environmental factors are different, but our bodies are the same. Essentially, how we deal with the food we put into our bodies is the same. So we to even start that conversation about how we should be eating and feeding a healthy human body, we have to understand our ancestral dietary past, which is really, in my mind, something you have to look at for the past 3.5 million years to understand what we should be doing to feed ourselves biologically and nourish ourselves biologically. But you make a very, very, very good point. What's different about humans and other animals is that the experience of eating is more than just biological nutrition. There's cultural and emotional factors that come into play, and truly nourishing ourselves means more than just meeting those biological needs. We also have to meet or exceed those cultural and emotional needs. And that's where, blending, this is where the space that my work sits, blending what we understand about our ancestral dietary past with also understanding what modern life is really like, and modern demands and modern access to resources and all of those other sorts of things is really, really important.
I think the first person who told me kind of explained it in a way that I was like, that makes a lot of sense, is that if you wouldn't feed your dog like Skittles, you wouldn't feed your dog has a certain diet, you wouldn't water a flower with a Mountain Dew. Flowers have certain foods that they need to grow, and so all living things have these certain things that they need to grow and to thrive. And if we're not trying to do what a human is supposed to do, then that's why it can lead to not developing correctly and other things later in life. But since you go and you look at different artifacts, I can't help but imagine that artifacts are up for interpretation. So I could see, you can say, oh, this was for cutting animals, and somebody else will say, no, it's for cutting down coconuts. So we're supposed to be more like a vegan lifestyle. So how do you know? I never know who to trust. I'm like, if everything's up for interpretation, like how do we know that you find something and that is what it is used for versus somebody else says the complete opposite thing?
That is so brilliant. For all the podcasts that I've been on and conversations I've had and talks I've given, you are the first person to bring that up on your own, that the archaeological record is fully up to interpretation. Seriously, I'm so impressed. For some reason we place archaeology sometimes in our minds in the hard sciences, with biology and chemistry and physics, and it's not. Understanding soil science and the way that we go about excavating a site and the mathematics and the recording of it, all of that is incredibly precise and scientific when it's done right. But you're right, as soon as an artifact comes out of the ground, everything from that point forward is up for interpretation, and is such a product of archaeologists and anthropologists in general do everything they can to be unbiased, but we're humans and we all are. One of the best things we can do is just realize that we are and state that from the beginning. And so what's going on politically and socially at the time really influences how we interpret an archaeological site. So for a great example is, there was a lot of archaeology done in the mid 20th century, so the 1940s, the 1950s. Heck, Indiana Jones took place in the 1940s, right? So all of these things are happening and then in the 60s and the 70s. And because of a lot of reasons, one of them being the war effort, and everybody at home during World War II wanted to try to do something. So this idea of victory gardens was popping up, and oh my gosh, vegetables were celebrated more than ever, and more because mothers at home whose sons are off fighting a war in a foreign country just want to do something and feel important. So the government tells them, oh, we'll plant a garden and you're helping. And all of a sudden, it's, vegetables are celebrated, and Popeye's eating spinach, and everybody's all of a sudden now vegetables are so important. Archaeologists armed with this in the back of their minds are going to archaeological sites and trying to show that, people are eating a ton of vegetables in the past. It really impacted how those interpretations were. Now, the past several decades, that's flipped. There's a lot of our anthropologists and archaeologists that really understand the value of animal-based products in our foods, and are doing everything that we can to find traces of that information in the archaeological record, and we're finding it. And a lot of archaeology interpretations are getting rewritten. Now, I will say there is some scientific, it's not just we pull up an artifact and there's, whatever the whim of the archaeologist is and all that. There are really good ways of identifying certain things on artifacts. So for example, I'll show you. This is, an example of a replica of a stone tool. And one of the things, the work that I do is we take and replicate the types of tools that we find and put them through a number of different experiments to say, okay, is this great at cutting up a root, or is it better at butchering an animal, and figure those sorts of things. And then we realize that a lot of these rocks, no matter what they are porous, and there are residues from the foods that were being processed actually in the pores of the rocks. And sometimes these residues can last for thousands and thousands of years. So we can actually pull those residues out and identify not only if it was a plant or an animal, but sometimes down to the actual species. So it's a combination of enhanced archaeological lab methods to analyze artifacts, and really what's happening politically and socially that are impacting how the archaeologists are interpreting sites. But the nice thing now is that we have so many archaeologists and anthropologists in all these different camps, right, that are reinterpreting all these different sites, that the conversation is actually more exciting than it ever has been. And we're going back and forth. We're finding, one thing we have found is that we do know that there are butchered bones from animals that were butchered, scavenged by humans or our ancestors and butchered with stone tools that date to 3.4 million years ago. And that is, that's not as much up for interpretation. We've actually found those and identified those tool marks on the bones.
I can only imagine your life is so exciting. I mean, this is just, I know that we're gonna get more into like places you've been and people you've met, but I can just imagine how exciting your life is. I've heard you say before, humans are omnivores through technology. What does that mean, and what technologies are you talking about when you refer to technology?
When you mentioned earlier, you wouldn't, and this, I was actually thinking about this when you were saying it, you wouldn't feed a dog Skittles, and you wouldn't feed or water a plant with Mountain Dew, and those things can make complete sense. And in that case, you've identified two different living beings that have specific diets that they're designed to consume. And by giving a dog Skittles, you're giving it something it's not designed to consume. And by giving a plant, Mountain Dew, you're giving it something it's not designed to consume. And for all the animals and plants in the world, we can identify what they're designed to consume. Humans are different. So humans began to mess around with nature about 3.5 million years ago when we made our first stone tool. Actually, hold on a second. I have a replica of it, please. This is when we were in Kenya years ago. It was not long after this artifact was first identified, and we were at the National Museum in Kenya and saw the real one. We were the state archaeologists in Kenya, and I was able to get a replica of the actual tool itself. So this tool, this is the actual tool. It may not look like much, but this, if they found both pieces of it just west of Lake Turkana in Kenya, and it was made by taking one rock of the right material, striking it at the right angle with another rock, and in less than a second, this came off. Now, this is the exact size, exact morphology, the shape of the actual first tool. This dates to 3.3 million years ago. It may not look like much, but this edge, it's like, well, who cares? Well, think about this. If all you're doing is relying on your own body to get and process all the natural resources around you, you're quite limited. I mean, all you have is our teeth, which compared to other animals are useless. These nails, which we pay people to cut and to polish, right? We don't really use them. So that's all we're left with. So in order to access resources from our environment, we create technologies to overcome our own physical limitations and get at those things. And this was the tool that was being used. Tools like this were being used to cut off large pieces of meat and joints of meat from animals that were killed by other predators, so that we could, bring them back to safety and bring them to elderly and the sick and our children and things like that. In less than a second, when this tool was created, the edge was you created a razor sharp edge that was sharper and more durable than anything we have on our bodies. This may not look like much, but the creation of this tool and everything since then allowed us to overcome our physical limitations and interact with our world in completely new ways. We actually began to domesticate ourselves, or put ourselves in a culturally created environment, when we created tools like this and other tools and technologies such as fire and hunting and trapping and fermentation. And what we did throughout all these technologies is provided the opportunity for our ancestors to get resources from the environment that we never could before, and most importantly, do things to those resources to make them safe and nourishing for our bodies. We almost, for the carnivore and keto people listening to this is going to be hard to hear, but bear with me for a second. We are not designed to eat almost every food that we eat, and that includes animal-based foods. We are not designed to do it. If you go back and strip ourselves of all of our technologies and literally just like imagine yourself strip down, and this is a vulnerable thing to think about, not in a psychological way, but strip yourself completely naked and put yourself outside in the middle of the woods. Now, pretend you are the most amazing survivalist in the world, and you know all the wild plants, and you know how the behavior patterns of all the animals, and mind-wise, you're armed with all the information that you need, but you are literally stripped down to nothing but your bare, fairly hairless body, and you're outside. Now, that's vulnerable, right? Number one, for most people listening, at some point in the year, you would die of exposure without some kind of technology. So number one, immediately us as a species are limited to a latitude range that allows us to not die because of exposure to weather, right? So let's say that's taken care of. Every one of us would die of starvation eventually, because our bodies and our brains have grown so big and are so nutrient needy. We've outgrown our digestive tract, and we require nutrition that we're not designed naturally to get. So these technologies allowed us to overcome these limitations, access these resources, including animal-based products, which I am convinced animal-based foods and animal-based diets are actually what built us as humans. So I'm in the same place as you all are, but understand that the only way we're able to access those animals and the nutrients that they can provide is through technology. Atlatls, bows, spears, boomerangs, traps, fishing equipment, all of those kinds of things allowed us to overcome these limitations. So we could through technology, we could access these resources, and most importantly, process them to make them as safe and nourishing as possible before we put them in our bodies. We have one of the least efficient digestive tracts of any animal on the planet. And the only way that we can eat most of these resources is by doing something to them first to make those nutrients safe and accessible to our bodies.
So what do you think then? So if we didn't have these technologies, what do you think that we were eating?
Well, we were pretty confident we know what we were eating. So prior to any of these technologies, we were herbivores and insectivores. Herbivores, frugivores, and insectivores. So we were eating a very limited amount of wild plants, wild fruits, and insects. And of those three things, insects were the most nutrient dense and bioavailable of all of it. And remember, when you think about our gathering, foraging ancestors, which composed 99% of our existence, and any plants we ate were always wild up until recent times. It's nothing like going into the grocery store today. No, these wild plants required processing. All plants, period, have some level of toxin in them, especially the wild ones need some sort of detoxification to them. So if we have no technologies, our range of plants that we can just pick and consume is very limited. Plus, you're talking about eating hyper seasonally and hyper local. So there was only a little bit of food we had access to, and then the insects. So we were, well, I should have actually had this case all set up anyhow before this. This is the size of our ancestors about at that time. Like this is, if we look at their brain, their brain is smaller, about the size, just a little bit smaller than my fist. And a full-grown adult stood at about 3.5 feet tall. So their nutritional requirements were very, very low, and they could meet those nutritional needs by, through fruits, through vegetables, and through insects. But if we jump forward, I don't have modern day Homo sapien right here, but this is close enough. Well, this is, I don't know where my skulls went. This is a Homo erectus. This is our ancestors when we actually started hunting and actually controlled fire at 2 million years ago. So this is about a little over 3.5 million years old. And this is about 2 million years old. Look at the difference. Number one, their brain size difference is massive. This is the largest jump in brain size we see in our evolutionary past. And their body size is quite different. Full-grown adults are 3.5 feet tall, full-grown adult here at almost modern proportions. So our nutritional needs have skyrocketed, and the only way we can meet those nutritional needs, or actually, a better way to say it is, the only way we could support this massive body and brain growth was by creating technologies that allowed us to access diverse nutrient-dense foods, and most importantly, process those nutrient-dense foods so that those nutrients in them were available to our incredibly inefficient digestive tract. So yes, can we as humans eat almost anything? Yes, but not because we're designed to, but because we created technologies that allowed us to do what other animals do inside their bodies, we do it before it goes into our mouths.
I love it. You're telling me this rock that you just showed is the reason why we are the height and the brain size that we are. It's because of a sharp rock.
100%. It is literally because of this tool that started it. That started it. You know, the definition of domestication is placing a species in a culturally managed environment, and they're in. So it could be anything. I mean, if you think about the way we deal with plants or animals, it could be, you know, we fence them in and keep them protected, or we feed them, or we water them, or we give them access to sunlight, or whatever we do to them. We selectively breed them, whatever, but it's a human created environment. And when they're in that human created environment long enough, they genetically change. And sometimes to the point where the new creation can't survive outside of that culturally created environment. So if you think about it, if that's the definition you go with, and that's what I go with, the first species ever to be domesticated wasn't maize at 8,000-9,000 years ago. It wasn't the dog at 35,000 years ago. It was actually humans beginning about 3.5 million years ago, because we started to create these tools. And I know it sounds strange. I mean, this is just a rock, right? But this tool is transformative. And when we did that, we changed our environment. We changed the resources we have access to. We did things that just our wild ancestors couldn't do with their own bodies. And now in that environment, we had more food, better resources, better access to the nutrients. Our bodies genetically changed over time. And now we're at a state that without technology, we would die. You know, if you've ever watched that show, Naked and Afraid, you know, that show, they filmed that show. I've talked to people that have been on the show and people that have produced the show. That show is 28 days long because people don't do anything. It takes 28 days to get enough content to fill a 45-minute, you know, show. What they do is that, number one, they do nothing and try to conserve energy. And number two, they make something to allow them to get something out of the environment. If it was literally just them and they weren't allowed to make anything and the show lasted long enough, all you'd see is people dying left and right, because we can't support our nutritional needs from these brains and these bodies without, and it could be very simple technologies, but without even simple technologies.
And you have the fire on your shirt too. So what happened with fire? Because I know nowadays, modern day, I feel like we might be reversing things. You hear about people saying, oh, eat raw eggs, or, you know, maybe have raw beef or other kinds, or raw vegetables. Are we doing things backwards now? Or what happened with fire? Did that help us or hurt us?
No, at that time, it really helped us. So understand, and I wish we had a different word, but I say food processing. And if I'm talking about the past in general, I'm talking about food processing technologies our ancestors developed to do three things: make food safe, nutrient dense, and bioavailable. And those are awesome. That approach to our food literally built us biologically and culturally as a species. We're here today because of millions of years of doing just that and finding out ways to do it even better. Food processing today, modern food processing, unfortunately, is at the expense of all three of those: safety, nutrient density, and bioavailability. Instead, it's focused on making other people a heck of a lot of money. It's focused on shelf life and uniformity in a grocery store and, you know, those sorts of things. So number one, please understand that. Also, you make a very good point. Now, should we be cooking our meat? Should we be cooking these vegetables? And what does that do to the nutrients? Well, it depends. When we look at our ancestral past and the technologies our ancestors developed, most of the brain power, and I mean, think about it, for 3.5 million years, the smartest of the Albert Einsteins of humans and all of our ancestors were focused on creating tools and technologies that gave us better and more nourishing food. I mean, literally almost every single prehistoric artifact has something to do with food. And that's really powerful when you think about it that way. And almost all of them made food safer and more nourishing for our bodies, and almost all of them actually built us. But when we think about, if we divide the technologies related to plants and the technologies related to animals in our diets, it's very, and this is pre-agriculture, what we see is almost all the technologies focused on animals were about getting the animal, overcoming poor eyesight or or being slow or not being able to have speed, or, making tools and technologies that allowed us to take down animals in the African savannah, spears and bows and arrows and those kind of things. And then once you have that animal down, all you need to do is open it up and you have complete access to almost all the nutrients. There's some studies that suggest mechanically breaking down red meat, like by slicing or grinding, and even a little bit of cooking helps make those a little bit of cooking, not a lot, helps make those nutrients a little bit more accessible to our bodies, to human bodies. But that's not the same thing with the blood, the fat, and the organs. I mean, almost in its entirety, blood, fat, and organs are completely bioavailable in their raw state, and you can just dive in and start eating. So the technological developments related to animals were about capturing that animal, and there wasn't much needed to do it. You don't have to detoxify things. You don't have to do things to release the nutrients. They're just there. Plants are exactly the opposite. Most of the technologies and brain power that went into dealing with plants in our diets were focused on two things: making these plants safe, because all plants have some level of toxin in them. And especially with wild plants, in most of the cases, we have to do something to those toxins to neutralize them or make them safer for us to eat. And even though plants do have nutrition, and they do, a lot of that nutrition is locked up in the plant and not accessible to our human bodies through our own digestive tract without some kind of help. So technologies related to plants were focused on making plants safe and making those nutrients available to our bodies through things like fermentation and nixtamalization and geophagy and other sorts of things. So when you think about it today, it's the exact opposite. We somehow somebody has made somebody believe that we should be eating a bunch of raw vegetables, and I don't understand why. And then we overcook most of our meat. What we really should be doing is spending a lot of time in the produce section teaching people, if you're going to eat these vegetables, you need to think about them. Some of them you should never eat. Some of them you need to do things to. And just because it says on the label it has this much iron, it doesn't mean that iron is accessible to your bodies. You might as well go eat a steak or a heart instead. And if you're going to eat them, this is what you do to make them safe. So you make a really good point. Some of the things we're doing to our food now is making them less nutrient available, making the nutrients less available to us, overcooking, for example, and those sorts of things. And we're not spending enough time educating people, especially on the dangers of plants. And if you're going to include plants in your diet, which we do, there's things you should be doing to those plants to make them safer.
Couple questions now.
Okay, I'm sorry. That was a big tirade.
So, you said that people, they had more tools to help detoxify the toxins in plants. Mm-hmm. But so do we know this because of just the amount of tools for the plants, or how? I don't know how our ancestors, millions or thousands of years ago would have thought, I think there's toxins in plants. They didn't have Google. They didn't have anybody to teach them this. So how did they know this? Was it just like, how do we know that they knew that?
Well, that is a very, very, very good question. And some of it is certainly interpretation. A lot of it is based on what we do see in the archaeological record. And a whole bunch of it is because of a combination of all these things, also with a lot of work done with living indigenous and traditional groups and looking at sort of the modern day correlates and how they deal with the food and the plants around them. And one thing that I'll say before we dive deep into this is most people today get their nutritional information from books, from doctors, from podcasts, from YouTube videos, and all these, and that's great. But what we've forgotten is that we are armed with everything that we need to make the nutritional choices for ourselves for what we should or shouldn't put into our own bodies. And that's our nose and our eyes and our mouth and our fingers and our ears. I mean, these things are there for the purpose of I remember growing up, I've been foraging now for 39 years. I bring these wild plants home and I was fermenting, putting all these things in different places. And most of the things I was dealing with didn't have a label. So, this is the 1970s and 1980s, where if you were a good parent, everything had a label. We listened to the FDA, and if it had a sell-by date, you just threw it away. You didn't even check if it was good, right? If it was past it. So, I'm taking stuff out and I'm smelling it and I'm tasting it. My mom was cringing. So what are you doing? I'm like, I want to know if the food is good. said, what is there a sell-by date on it? And we've forgotten this. Now, I don't know if you've heard me say this before, and I hope it's appropriate, but there's three things in our human experience that are truly sensual. And when I mean sensual, I mean all of our senses are firing and operating at the same time, and are really at a heightened sense. One is safety, one is reproduction, and one is food. And these are not by mistake. I mean, these are evolutionary designed reactions to the three most important things we need to do and do properly if we're going to continue as a species, right? Species need to reproduce. Every plant or animal, human, dog, or wild hyena, need to reproduce viable offspring, and that viable offspring needs to reproduce viable offspring, and this has to continue. If anywhere in that process breaks down, then we go extinct. So it makes sense. And anybody who, if we do these things right, they feel really, really good. And if we do them wrong, they feel really, really bad, and they should. So feeding ourselves and feeding our offspring, our kids, and having this should feel good. It should smell good. It should taste good. It should sound good. All of these things should happen if it's proper. If you talk to any forager who's truly not just picking dandelions in the backyard, but people that are really engaged in the act of foraging. And I mean, it could be in the middle of New York City, or it can be in the middle of the woods and somewhere else. They are in tune with their senses. They know, you pick a plant, you put it in your mouth. Plants are not here. I know I'm jumping around, but plants are not here to feed us. They weren't put on this planet to feed us. They're on this planet trying to do the same thing as every other living species, reproduce viable offspring. And that means protecting themselves and their offspring so that they can, do what they need to do. It doesn't make sense for a plant to contain a toxin. And it's a lot of work for a plant to have a toxin. Remember, it's a trade-off. Producing toxins is not just, it's just going to have a toxin. A plant, it requires energy. It requires work to create these toxins. So the plant toxins are there because it makes sense through evolutionary processes for it to be there. It's a protective mechanism. And it doesn't make sense for a plant to have a toxin that it doesn't let the predator know that it's there, right? If it has a toxin, but the plant got completely eaten, then it didn't do its job, right? The plant is still dead and it couldn't reproduce. So this isn't across the board always, but in most cases, a plant will let you know a toxin is present through a taste, through a reaction, through a smell, through something. And people, it isn't like you took a modern day person out of New York City and stuck them into the middle of the woods and say, forage and figure out if a plant is toxic. We're talking about people that are in tune with their environment, with their plants. Things have been passed down from generation to generation to generation, and understand, not only that plants are something we should not necessarily fear, but respect, approach with caution, and here are some mechanisms that we can use to make them safe. Now, certainly, there's no doubt there are a whole bunch of people died by doing the wrong thing at certain times in the past. They've eaten the wrong plant. They've done it the wrong way. One mistake, one trap we often fall into is this thought that everything that people did in the past was intentional. Why the heck? There's a group, an Aymara Indians in the Altiplano region of Bolivia I spent time with, that detoxify potatoes through a practice called pasá. They actually eat a certain kind of clay at the same time they eat these very toxic, literally will kill you, potatoes, and the clays bind with the toxins and pass through their bodies, and they're unharmed, and they get the nutrition from the potatoes. How did they figure that out? Who sat down and said they should eat the clay with the potatoes? And it wasn't like that. It was more likely the case that a whole bunch of people died by eating these potatoes, but this one group, and it could have been a mistake. It could have been because they were eating clay and mud with something else, but they happened to do this. And that particular group that did it right and did it well were the ones that survived the childbearing age, and their kids survived the childbearing age. And it became routine, and it just became a part of their culture. And it wasn't necessarily deliberate, but it became enculturated and just became a part of life. And here we are as modern people, so disconnected from our food, trying to figure all these things out. We're just trying to kind of reclaim that traditional knowledge.